I feel like it almost goes without saying that Dark Souls is one of the most influential games of the 2010s and then now the 2020s. It might just be one of the most influential games of all time, but given the unknowable vastness of time, I still feel like it's a little too early for me to make that call. Dark Souls' influence can be seen in just about every corner of the gaming world, from boss fights with giant health bars at the top of the screen, to vast interconnected worlds that encourage player exploration, to intentionally obtuse mechanics that require players to dig deep into the systems of the game to be understood. Dark Souls wasn't the first game to use many of the mechanics that have now become synonymous with its name, but ever since it made its debut in 2011, gaming fans have become enamored by the genre that Dark Souls helped define, the Soulslike. As is the case with just about any subgenre, Soulslike can often be a little difficult to fully define. A lot of people tend to throw out the term Soulslike for just shorthand for a difficult game, which I personally just don't agree with. In the mid-2010s, before the genre was solidified in the way that it is today, it was extremely common to hear the phrase the Dark Souls of to refer to a game that was just moderately difficult or complex.
I think we've kind of made the Dark Souls of competitive first-person shooters.
And no hate to any of the devs or journalists or anyone who used that phrase. You had to market your game, you had to market your article. I totally do 100% get it. It's just in retrospect, everyone using that phrase just feels a little bit silly now. You know what I mean? But at this point, I feel like it's pretty widely accepted that not every game that uses a single mechanic from Dark Souls is part of the Souls-like genre. For example, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has boss fights against enemies with their names written in large text at the top of the screen above giant health bars, but no one would argue that Tears of the Kingdom is a Souls-like in any way. So then, what is a Souls-like? As talked to death as that question is, I do think it's actually kind of an important one to ask, given the near constant stream of games that are coming out that directly cite Fromsoftware's catalog as inspiration. I also think it's relevant since, for the first time since Demon's Souls launched in 2009, Fromsoftware is returning to the Armored Core series with the release of Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon.
There will be nothing left but dying embers. There's no greater threat than power without purpose.
Authorization acquired. Terminate them.
With the launch of AC6, plenty of people are wondering if the series is going to adopt Souls-like elements that FromSoftware has been using for nearly 15 years since Demon's Souls came out. When it comes to defining the term Souls-like, I think it's obvious that different people are going to have different definitions of the genre, but I'd love to throw my hat in the ring here since I have some thoughts. To start, a Souls-like isn't just a game that's taken inspiration from any of FromSoftware's games since the release of Demon's Souls. As covered previously, FromSoftware has created some of the most influential games of the last 15 years, so the studio's fingerprints can be seen across the entire industry, and as a result, just using a single mechanic from Dark Souls or Bloodborne or whatever doesn't make something into a Souls-like. Instead, we have to break down some of the mechanics that made Demon's Souls and Dark Souls so unique and fresh in the first place, and I think a really good place to start with that is bonfires. All of FromSoft's games since Demon's Souls have featured checkpoints that players have to manually engage with. While their precise mechanics vary from game to game, bonfires generally serve several purposes. The first is to provide you a place to respawn when you die, and you will die. So when you die, you'll start back up at the last bonfire you rested at. It's simple checkpoint stuff. Bonfires also usually replenish healing items and provide the player a place to spend experience points to level up. The final and perhaps most important thing that bonfires do is that after resting, all of the enemies in the area will respawn. Manual checkpoints that reset enemies like Dark Souls' bonfires, Bloodborne's lamps, and Elden Ring's Sites of Grace are, in my opinion, a key component of what makes a Souls-like a Souls-like. The individual mechanics of what the checkpoint can do and how interacting with it changes the game can vary, but I think that their existence is required for capturing two other critical Souls-like elements: meaningful progression and meaningful loss. These two elements are intertwined as they both have to feed into one another. As you kill enemies and bosses in Dark Souls, you acquire souls, which is just, a fancy name for your upgrade currency, right? So while the name of that currency can change from game to game, with souls in Dark Souls and runes in Elden Ring, all FromSoftware games have it, and to me, all Souls-likes need to have it as well. If you die in a Souls-like game, and again, you were gonna die, you'll lose all your souls with only a single chance to get them back, otherwise they're gonna be gone for good. Because it's possible to lose character progress if you don't spend those souls, the upgrades are truly meaningful, which makes their loss meaningful as well. When paired with how challenging Souls games can be, that risk-reward gameplay loop is a big part of what makes the Souls-like genre so enticing to so many people. There are some other elements too that I think help define the genre, but aren't exactly necessary as long as there are other mechanics in place to compensate for them if they're not included, like dodge rolls with invincibility frames, stamina management, and input buffering. A Souls-like game doesn't need to have these things, but given how integral they are to the combat mechanics of Soulsborne games, most Souls-likes tend to include them. Additionally, there are some non-combat related mechanics that, to me, aren't required, but many Souls-like games include, like bombastic boss fights or a sprawling interconnected world. Like the combat mechanics I just listed, they're not all required as long as the rest of the game has an interesting mechanical loop that's centered around meaningful progression and meaningful loss. As a matter of fact, even Fromsoftware doesn't use every mechanic that's typically associated with Souls-like games in the Dark Souls series. Take Dark Souls 3, for example. The game is fairly linear and doesn't lean on the Metroidvania-esque design that previous games in the series have used, but its combat is so solid and its bosses are so memorable that it doesn't matter too much if its world isn't as interconnected as the one in the original Dark Souls. So those are the elements that help me define the Souls-like genre, but that all said, there is still something about it that's still hard to put words to, and often at the end of the day just comes down to if a game feels like a Souls-like. And I know that's not entirely helpful, but here's an example of what I mean. Star Wars Jedi Survivor ticks most of the boxes mentioned above with its meditation point checkpoints, meaningful character progression through upgrades, and interconnected levels, but there's just something about it that doesn't seem to check that final Souls-like box for me. It may very well be the tone of the writing and story, since Star Wars tends to not be as oppressively bleak as FromSoft's games usually are and or excluded. The same can be said about a game like Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, which also ticks a lot of these Souls-like boxes for me, but for whatever reason falls short in the feel category.
We're here to kill chaos.
The prophecy's very own warriors of light.
I honestly would love to know what you think in the comments about if the feel of a Souls-like actually matters for it to end up in the genre, because part of me feels like it's gatekeepy to exclude something based on this undefinable aspect of it, but I don't know, I have a hard time putting to words that sort of element of it, because when you really boil down the differences between something like Jedi Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor and Sekiro, for example, they have the same mechanics for the most part. Sekiro is just harder. I don't know, let me know. So with the Souls-like genre generally defined by its mechanics, here are a handful of mainstream examples that I think perfectly encapsulate it. Hollow Knight, Salt and Sanctuary, Lies of P, Mortal Shell, Remnant 2, I could go on. If you've played any of those games, you'll know that each has mechanics individual to it that puts a spin on the Souls-like format, but each one still stays resolutely in the genre. So now comes the question, is Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon a Souls-like? And the straightforward and simple answer is just no, it's not. It doesn't use the checkpoint system like those found in the Soulsborne catalog. Its character progression is handled completely differently with its garage system than leveling up is in Dark Souls, and it takes an entirely different approach to level design, combat, and overall structure to the design philosophies found in most Souls-like games. That said, FromSoftware has spoken specifically about the influence that its past games have had on the development of Armored Core 6. Speaking to YouTuber Iron Pineapple during a preview event for the game, Armored Core 6 director Masaru Yamamura said, quote, "It was our policy to make AC6 AC. However, the development of our last 10 years of titles was important, and we wanted to incorporate elements that made sense from that knowledge. Not necessarily direct takings from specific games, but thinking from that accumulated experience of game development," end quote. So when looking at footage of the game, and actually playing it for that matter, I think it's really easy to see where FromSoftware implemented a lot of that accumulated game dev experience that Yamamura mentioned, while also being able to recognize how, fundamentally, Armored Core 6 differs from the games of FromSoft's past. The comparisons really start to shine when looking at Armored Core's boss fights, which all feature giant mech enemies that have diverse movesets that players will need to become familiar with if they want to overcome them. On the surface, that, of course, looks a lot like how bosses are handled in Dark Souls, but once you get under the hood of the game, it becomes clear that the similarities pretty much just start and end there. Armored Core 6 isn't a Souls-like, full stop. However, it's clear that it's still taking plenty of influence from the rest of Fromsoftware's previous work, and I think at the end of the day, that sort of development will make for some incredibly interesting games in the future if Fromsoftware continues to take influence from its own history in order to create new kinds of games using certain tried and true mechanics. For example, I've gone back and forth on if Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is actually a Souls-like, and I couldn't quite come up with an answer. It's got plenty of elements that make Souls-likes Souls-likes, but it's undeniably missing plenty of genre staples, like with its leveling system and complete lack of stamina management. I wasn't coming up with an answer though, and like to be completely transparent, I've actually never finished the game. I always get stuck in the first few hours when combat starts getting like, actually kind of difficult. So to get to the bottom of it, this week I played through the entire thing. After completing it, however, I realized that Sekiro kind of has a lot in common with Armored Core 6 in that it's something of a departure from what fans have come to expect from Fromsoftware. Obviously, the Dark Souls Sekiro comparisons are a little bit closer than the Dark Souls Armored Core 6 ones, but in a lot of ways, I think that Fromsoftware fans are going to feel a little bit subverted when picking up Armored Core for the first time, in the same way that many fans, myself included, felt when trying Sekiro at launch in 2019 for the first time. So here are the main takeaways from this rant. Number 1, Armored Core 6 is not a Souls-like, but it's impossible to take the FromSoft out of FromSoft. So we'll likely be picking apart the exact mechanical comparisons between AC and the Soulsborne series for a good long while. Number 2, actually defining a subgenre of video games like the Souls-like can be a little bit dicey and often comes down to personal experience and perspective with a specific game in the genre. Number 3, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is a truly magnificent game that is very much worth playing, and I formally apologize for having not finished it sooner. And number 4, the Souls-like genre includes some of the best video games ever made, both developed by Fromsoftware and made elsewhere. So at the end of the day, the exact definition doesn't even really matter as long as the games are good. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to know what you think about how Souls-likes should be defined in the comments. And you know what? You can even hit me with a Souls-like hot take. I would love to read it. My name is Peter Hunt Spitek. For all things Armored Core 6, make sure to subscribe to Dual Shockers and remember to click the bell icon to be notified every time we post more videos like this. Catch you later. Bye.